And the topic is, who is the master? So what we're going to be talking about is determining what the master system is. What is, when I say master, what do I mean? And what to think about as you connect systems together and how that term master applies. We will touch on some integration hurdles, things that we as TopStep see quite often, or obviously bring to the table when integrations are being discussed so that we don't run into pitfalls, that lessons learned and all that kind of stuff from the integrations we've done in the past. And another common thing regarding integrations is the data synchronization. So how far do you take a data sync when you connect systems together? How far do you take that data exchange? So we'll touch on all three of those topics, but a majority of it is really starting off with the initial question is, how do you identify a master system? What does a master system mean? The master system is the system that should be owning the source of the information. So for example, projects, project information, project tracking, the master is typically in your PSA or your professional services automation tool. Your official customer contact information may belong in your accounting system because of the invoicing activities. It may actually be owned by your sales system, but it's one of those systems is the source of truth, and that's the system that you want to focus on maintaining as you go forward. So the source of the information that you need to pass as you're connecting systems together is the master system. And then the other system I'm referring to the rest of this presentation as the receiver or the recipient system. Okay. So there's lots of questions regarding this, can there be two masters of data? We'll touch on that topic, but the general information is, if you have two masters, just like anything else, two people in charge sometimes causes conflict. So let's start with a really basic question of, do I need a master? And our opinion at TopStep is yes, you should have a master, because something needs to be the source of truth. Something needs to be the point that you are focused on for audit purposes and to make sure that that information is kept up to date. That source information is then the basis of passing information from the master system to the receiver systems. So even something as simple as the accurate name of a client. Many of you have worked with clients or worked at companies where the company name has changed. TopStep, for example, has changed from an LLC to an incorporated. So there is a master system that we have in-house that changes LLC to Inc., and that is then passed into our other system of records so that we don't have to touch and maintain the data in each system independently. That's the whole purpose of integration. So you do have to have a master system, and the master and the owner of the data is really driven by it typically is driven by where does the data start. All right? So if there is a starting system that you enter the record into, and then it passes on to system B and system C and system D, that typically becomes your master, unless there's some other major driver where it's a feeder system and then the master is taken over by another product or another solution. Okay. The master system also is the system that's driving the initial content of the fields or of the data, and so the receiving system may have to actually do data transformation to understand how to receive that information. Something as simple as a checkbox can be stored as a yes, no in one system and a 1 and a 0 in a different system. So that master system is the one that will own the original source of data, but then transformations have to happen to have it be received by a receiver system. So we do think you do need a master. Synchronization does work best if there is a master, and at least you have a single system to focus on. Now, right away, many integrations are a two-way street. There's integrations that pass from the master to the receiver, but then the receiver turns around and sends stuff back to the master. Does that mean they're both masters? That really depends on how the two systems are talking to each other back and forth. So there's really two different two-way types of integrations at a very high level. One is the two systems are connected, but they're passing very different data. between the two of them. So they're segregated pathways. And the other is there's actually an overlap of pathways between the two, and that's the more difficult of the two, as you can imagine, because of the master-receiver relationship. Now, if I go into the first one, the master-receiver data is segregated. This is really like you're passing apples one way and you're getting oranges back. And that means even though the two systems are connected and they're talking in a bidirectional format, or bidirectional flow, they're not actually conflicting with each other because they are passing extremely different data back and forth. So they actually reverse the role. One's the master and the receiver one way, and then they reverse roles and it's master and receiver the other way. So, think about some of the systems you may have in-house that are connected, that are talking back and forth. Things like an HR system to a PSA. You hire somebody, you bring them on board, that user information about who it is, their email address, who's their manager, it's coming from the HR system into the PSA. HR system is the master. If somebody's manager changes, you change it in the HR system, flows through the PSA. The PSA system may be used because it's a timekeeping system often to track vacation balances, which the HR system should know. So in some companies, people are logging into two systems and entering that data, but ideally for user efficiency, they're putting that information into the PSA, and then you just build an integration from the PSA back to the HR system so the PSA can talk to the HR system in terms of the user, because the HR system is the one that originated the data, but the PSA is the owner or the master of the PTO balance, or the vacation balance amount. And that information then passes from the PSA to the HR system so that the HR people can take a look and see what may need adjustment in the PSA system as necessary. Okay. Another common segregated thing that are connected but very different flows are, the PSA is sending invoice information over to the accounting system. Maybe they're doing pro forma invoices, or they're doing formal invoices, customer-facing invoices. They pass that to accounting. Payments are received by the accounting or the finance team, which are recorded in the accounting system, and then the accounting system talks back to PSA to pass payment information. Same object related invoice from PSA to accounting, and then payment from accounting back to PSA, but again, very different pathways because there's really not a conflict of data between the two. Okay? There tends to be a common element or a common object that allows the systems to talk back and forth. And there's a reason, because they're still an owner of the data. The HR system owns user data. The PSA system owns PTO balances. Okay. When the data overlaps, then we get a little bit more of a push-me-pull-you situation, if anyone remembers their Dr. Doolittle days, which means the data overlap means certain fields, not maybe everything, but certain fields are owned by both systems. So this is where you get into last one wins type thing, or adding some kind of logic that understands when to stop ping-ponging back and forth. I pass client information from my CRM or my sales system into my PSA. My PSA changes the name because they want to use like a shorter version of the name. That name passes back to my sales system. My salesperson says, no, I really like this name. They updated it, passes back to PSA, and you're going back and forth. Now, client name is probably not one of those that you would pass back and forth like that, but there are underlying fields that you may feel that are not as critical, but the back and forth really makes the information unreliable potentially because there is no master. Whoever happens to update it in whatever system drives the change into the other system, and it could literally go back and forth. So this kind of goes back to why do you need a master? I have been involved with integration designs where there tends to be a big circle. It starts in system A, it passes to system B, it passes to system C. System C can change it, and system C passes it back to system A. That's all well and good, but when you have that sort of looping mechanism, that dual ownership, you have to make a decision as to what system touches it last, and that becomes the master system. Okay. In my example about the, system A passing to B, passing to C, and then C can change it, C ideally becomes the master system of that information. In this particular design that I was involved in, the customer requirement was we need to default the project manager, and that default can be picked by the salesperson. So then the sales system, they picked the default project manager based on their awareness of the professional services team. That passed actually through the accounting system into the PSA system. The PSA system was the system of record for project management. And at that point, the professional services team could decide who actually would be the project manager. And that allowed the professional services team to update that same field and pass that project manager data back to the sales system to close the loop and to communicate to the salesperson that the project manager is not Jody, it's Ron. In that case, the integration logic halted at that point because any changes on the sales side for that field no longer passed all the way through the loop because the master system was deemed the professional services automation tool. So a long explanation for something that may be very, very obvious, but it's sometimes you get, can't see the forest through the trees because you're so involved in mapping fields, and then you don't realize that you've actually just put yourself into a big circle that never ends. So definitely keep in mind if you are passing data that's coming to and from the same system with an overlap, you still have to define who is the final master. Otherwise, you'll never have a stable field value. Okay, avoid it whenever possible. Now, there's other things about master where it's more of an initial default type thing. So this is why I call this the transform data ownership. So if I need to have data from a master system and pass it into a PSA system, or from PSA into an accounting system, the initial value that I pass from the master to the receiver is the default value. But for those of you who have been involved in integrations, you may have had discussions that say, but I don't like the name that the opportunity is called in our sales system. This is a pretty common example. The salesperson is calling this the PSA deployment plus integration project. And when it comes into, when the deal is won and it comes into your PSA, the name PSA deployment plus integrations is too generic. We want to be able to call it, multi-site system deployment or something like that. And that's all well and good as long as the accounting system can also understand that name. But the default comes in from the CRM, and then you can make a decision that, although we originally had a master-receiver relationship, that data should actually be owned by, the PSA in this example. So the master changes to be the PSA. So the master project name, the one that everyone refers to when they're talking about the project, is the one that's in PSA, not what the original name was in the CRM. So it's really a sort of a transfer or transformation of data and identifying who's the originator, who's the actual owner at the end of the day. So my example of a master system always being the place that the data starts from, that's always a good starting point to define a master, but it's really who owns the last update, like we did in the previous example. Whoever owns the last update becomes the master of that data. And that way you can rely on that as the master to maintain the data going forward. Now, what about connecting three systems? And the reason I call this, this question, we just talked about the loop, right? The sales to accounting to PSA. But that loop, that three-system connection was actually something that in my head, I always think of it as a leapfrog integration. You really, at the end of the day, you're trying to get data from system A to system C. And you don't want to build an integration from system A to system C because you already have an integration from A to B, and you already have an integration from B to C. So, do you necessarily need a point-to-point for everything? Can you just basically use the common system as a transfer point or a leapfrog? So I have seen that done in a number of places. It is a cost-effective means in most cases because you're really just leveraging what's already there to be able to get information from point A to point C via B. It's that whole airline layover approach. So in that case, what you end up doing, though, is you end up passing information from a master to a receiver where the receiver has no need for that information. It's really a means to an end to get the information eventually into System C. So a sales system passing information about like the project manager that I said. The accounting system probably has zero need for that information, and they're at least storing it in a custom field or a text field or something, simply to be able to pass that data backwards into the PSA. And that's absolutely fine to do. Like I said, I think it's a cost-effective method for doing that, so you sort of have a master-master receiver, but really that interim system is more of a leapfrog system. It's really there to pass the data all the way through. Now, as we get into the integration hurdles, though, if you do some kind of multi-system connect to eventually get information from point A to point C via routing on other systems, you do have to start considering what impact that middle system could have on the data. Right? So let's talk about data transformation. So if I, connecting systems together or connecting three systems together as a leapfrog, you have the same hurdle, the same integration hurdle, is knowing the data tracking controls in the connecting systems and understanding limitations between the systems. So I use the checkbox example, yes, no versus 1 and 0. Or another common one I see is active, inactive, and 1 and 0. Like a system will store the letter A or the letter I, while another system uses the number 1 or the number 0 or blank. So all those are data transformation things that you have to make sure that you're aware of as you connect systems together. Fields may seem like they have the same value list, and then you find out the database, the data dictionary identifies the values are very different, and you have to do a transformation. My preference is always to have the integration logic do the transformation. Depends on how much of that logic the integration can handle. You may end up having to do that transformation as part of the system in preparing data to pass through an integration. The other thing to think about is size limits, field size limits. This is something I've run into things, like with QuickBooks or Oracle or something where there's just a text field limit on naming conventions. And so if you connect like a PSA to one of those accounting systems, something that you give a very long name to, you go to pass it to the accounting system and it truncates. And so now you have, in some cases, maybe a very different meaning between the longer name that's in one system and the shorter name that gets truncated in another system. Or in some cases, you may actually lose the uniqueness of the name because of the truncation. So as you connect systems together, data transformation and field limitations are two of the things you really need to be very familiar with the data dictionary in those systems before you can connect them. And then, of course, the master system is the one that's going to drive the initial values. When you connect three systems and you have a go-between or a middle system, you have to pay attention to even more, because if you built an integration between System A and System C, there may not be any dependencies or limitations, but if you pass data through a third system to get from A to C, maybe that impacts it. And that may be one of the decisions that forces you to say, well, we can't reuse these integrations. We have to build a new point solution between A and C, for example. Maintenance. So ideally when you build an integration, you build it in a way that allows the integration itself to maintain itself, adding new field values to drop-down lists or to selection values. Can the integration automatically create that information for reference as data is passed in? When you have, you're importing maybe timesheets, can the timesheet import create projects that are missing automatically? Things that, as you're building the integration, think about, well, will this value set change? Will this lookup change? And if it will change, is there a way that you can build that logic into the integration already as a safety net? If you can't, then what you'll need to do is make sure that there's an awareness of, hey, if I add a new account into my accounting system, I have to change my master, professional services tool to be able to pass invoice information to that new account. So I have to add that, and then I have to potentially update the integration depending on what data transformation I may need to do. So system changes, integration changes. Consider things that when you're mapping from A to B, if field values change or new items have to be identified and synchronized, can that be built into the integration, or do I have to do that on a regular basis manually? Okay. The other is understanding the limitations of the receiving system from your master system to a receiving system. My first hiccup with this type of limitation is really understanding how systems deal with their own data. You have a data dictionary, you understand what data dictionary values are, what field values are allowed, but then you find out systematically System A can't handle data from System B of this type. Okay. My first example of this situation was integrating a PSA system to an SAP timesheet system. And the PSA tool allows you to delete time, like just unapproved timesheets. If there's no dependencies on that data in the system, you can just go ahead and delete the timesheet. And the database identifies that as a deleted record. Whereas the SAP time card system doesn't understand delete, they understand the word cancel. So all records are marked as canceled, and they're still available to pull on reporting, but they are tagged as a canceled record, and so there's really no deletion action in the system. And that that was an interesting exercise to go through. How does the system deal with data? And not only for, like I said, from a data dictionary perspective, but from a functional perspective, from a process perspective, and a feature perspective. And that may be something that you have to consider when you're attaching systems together, because you can't assume passing data from A to B will always be accepted by B. Another example is a lot of accounting systems can't understand negative hours or negative rates. It's more of a credit type process. So systems that can pass information with negatives or positives in them cause problems with a system that can't handle negatives. They have to handle it as a credit approach. So the data transformation is much more important here. So it really comes down to, when you integrate systems, understanding the data transformation from a data dictionary, but also having subject matter experts of each system to understand how the data is handled from a feature functionality perspective as well. And there are many hurdles, but the final hurdle that I wanted to bring up here is, and something that's burned probably folks on the phone as well as us working with certain situations, is working in a test environment, making sure everything looks great in a test environment and everything's working great, and then you move it to production, and what happens? Things start breaking that didn't come up in test. And in most cases for us has been, there was something different in production. Value lists that were slightly different in production. Key ID dependencies are different in production. So something that we've adapted our processes to is to always have a production environment validation step before any further production cutover is discussed. And that may be something very obvious, but sometimes assumptions go a little bit too far. So the test environment being the same as production is also an integration hurdle, not necessarily a technical one, but it is a process one. Make sure that you're working in similar conditions to have success in production. Now, the last topic is my favorite topic, and I call it a think too far. And it's one of these things where you're connecting systems together to really pass data consistency, keep data consistent, have timely data between systems. But often I'm asked, well, can we just pass everything to like Salesforce? We want to pass everything to Salesforce and just make it easy because then we have one place to go for visibility and dashboards and all that kind of stuff. And in all honesty, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. But what it does require, though, is you're passing a lot of information to a system that is going to do nothing with it other than display it for visibility, for reporting. So in some cases, you may have to be customizing the recipient system with a bunch of custom objects or custom fields or text fields or things that are not very usable in that system because they don't mean anything in that system. It's just taking advantage of the fact that that system is going to be the the collector of all the information. When in reality, what may be better is to do more of a data warehouse where you put a reporting engine on top of it instead of picking a system like a sales system or your PSA as the central source for everything, because you may be pulling too much data in to be able to maintain it. And then you have to remember where the data came from if it's wrong. So now you have to go back to where was the master system because I shoved everything into my PSA, and I think this piece of data is owned by accounting and this piece of data is owned by HR, so I have to go and fix it all. So it's really a matter of do you want to use you bought the systems to use in some manner because they're best of breed and they fit your business model. Don't necessarily force that system to be your single system of information because it was purchased to support a specific part of your organization. Definitely use it for that part of the organization and try to avoid the tendency to say, well, it'll just be easier if I can just log into one system and see everything in one system. I'm not saying that's never the right answer. Occasionally it could be a benefit versus a cost of building that type of integration. But I would kind of go down more the path of a data warehouse almost and reporting tools on top of a data warehouse versus reusing a system that you've just built integrations to along the way. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to open up the phone lines for questions and conversation and dialogue. We'll stop the recording. But you can see from coming to the topics that I've gone through, defining a master really will drive a lot of the decisions about the data that you're passing and the types of data transformations that you're needing. You have to keep in mind the systems that you're connecting. They will have limitations. They will have uniqueness in how they handle feature functionality, and making sure that your environments are the same so that you have success going to production are all the different challenges that we personally have run into that we want to make sure that our lessons learned are passed on to others as well as you move forward with integration of systems.